Good morning and welcome to the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center's Curator's Corner. My name is Thorin Tritter. I'm the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center, which is located in Glen Cove, New York. Before we start, as I have been stating in recent Curator Corners, I want to make sure you know that our building is open to the public, so that I hope that you will be encouraged by this program or by my other programs to come and visit us in person and see the objects that I've been talking about in the museum. We're open Monday through Friday from 10 to 4:30 and on Saturday and Sunday from noon to 4. I also want to encourage you, as always, to pose any questions that come up during my presentation in the Q&A window of Zoom, and I'll make sure to look there and respond at the end of my talk. And as I have been also saying in recent programs, we have launched a Buy a Brick campaign where you can help support HMTC and honor a family member or special person through the placement of a personalized brick on the patio that we are creating overlooking the Children's Memorial Garden. I believe that an email went out last week and others will be following, but you can also find information about this on our website. And one other thing I'll mention is that we are always looking for sponsors of our public program series, like the Curator's Corner or our Sunday with Survivor series. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor, please contact our development director, Gail Peck, at the number there, and she will be able to give you much more information. We really would be grateful for your support. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about a photograph in our gallery of a GI named Horowitz, who served in the 7th Armored Division under General Patton during World War II. Hy was an active docent at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center for many years and gave generously of his time, energy, and money. While he passed away in 2016, his photograph is in our gallery and is a reminder of both his wartime service and his work with HMTC. And I want to express my gratitude to his family, particularly his son Marty, for their help in sharing information about Hy with me. There are good reasons to talk about Hy Horowitz regardless of any particular anniversary or date, but as I'm sure you know, tomorrow, November 11th, is Veterans Day, a day when the nation comes together to recognize and honor the men and women who've helped to safeguard our country. The date was originally observed as Armistice Day and falls on the anniversary of the end of World War I, the war that was supposedly the war to end all wars. President Calvin Coolidge called for a holiday on the anniversary of Armistice Day in 1926, although it took until 1938 before Congress enacted it as a national holiday in the United States. After World War II, President Eisenhower signed the bill that changed the holiday from Armistice Day to Veterans Day, although maintaining the November 11th date, because of a desire, obviously, by 1954, when this happened, to recognize not just soldiers from World War I, but all veterans. We often think of Veterans Day as a day marked by parades and pageantry, but of course, we shouldn't forget that that pageantry honors men and women who risked and sometimes gave their lives on bloody and frightening battlefields. Hy Horowitz, while greeted by cheering crowds during some of his service in Europe, was also in the midst of some of the hardest fighting of World War II. The brief caption that we have on his photograph hints at that broad service that he experienced during the war. He fought in the Normandy invasion on June 6, 1944. And if that was not rough enough, he also fought in the Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest single battle fought by the United States during World War II, where 90,000 Americans suffered as casualties. And Hy Horowitz went on to liberate concentration camps at Ohrdruf and Bergen-Belsen. Finally, in 2009, France inducted Hy Horowitz into the Legion of Honor as a Chevalier, as a knight. In some ways, Hy Horowitz was like many other GIs who served during World War II. He came from rural America, having grown up in Swan Lake, New York, about 10 miles north of the Woodstock music concert site, although that would be later in 1969, but about 55 miles west from Poughkeepsie. In 1920, when he was born, it was an agricultural hamlet that felt much further from the busy streets of Manhattan than it might today. His parents were Russian immigrants who had been given the land in Sullivan County because it was thought to be of little use for farming, but they made a go of it regardless. The stock market crash of 1929 and the depression that followed made things tough for High's family, forcing High to drop out of high school and to help out on the farm. Things changed for High and for many Americans on December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. High enlisted shortly after that and was sent down to Fort Polk in Louisiana to train with the 7th Armored Division. Our photograph was taken in the spring of 1942 in Fort Polk, when the brutality of the war in Europe was still in the future for High. He certainly did not know then that what he would face just 3 years later when his armored division burst through the fences around what appeared to be a military encampment in central Germany and became one of the first Americans to see firsthand the horrors of a Nazi concentration camp. Today, most Americans have some sense about what took place in those concentration camps. There are museums like ours or the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum on the Mall in Washington, D.C., or Yad Vashem in Israel, and dozens of others around the world that educate visitors about the Holocaust. And there are video testimonies, books, movies, and memorials at the site of many camps that enable visitors to get a sense firsthand of what took place in them. But in 1944, despite efforts by the Polish resistance fighters to get word out about Nazi atrocities, most Allied soldiers had no idea that the Nazis had implemented a plan to kill all the Jews of Europe, nor of the treatment of prisoners in concentration camps. It was the Red Army that discovered the first Nazi death camp when they arrived at Majdanek, near the Polish town of Lublin, where around 80,000 Jews had been murdered and burned in crematoria. Soviet soldiers, although familiar with Nazi mass shootings, found evidence of a completely different scale of murder than they'd seen before. But they found even more evidence of Nazi barbarism 6 months later, after pushing the Germans out of Krakow and discovering the camp at Auschwitz, where 1 million Jews were killed, mostly through gassing, and burned in a series of industrial crematoria. The Red Army quickly sent investigators and war correspondents to document the scope of Nazi atrocities and to prepare the first news materials for the press. The Red Army's discovery of Majdanek and then Treblinka, Sobibor, and Auschwitz, Chelmno and Belzec had already been closed by 1943. As the Russians found those camps in the summer of 44 and winter of 45, you would have thought that maybe Americans and the other allies should have been prepared for what to expect as they moved in from the West. But Americans were reluctant to believe that the Holocaust was taking place. That lack of belief was partially due to anti-Semitic bias and thinking such reports were fabricated, but it was also based on an unwillingness to comprehend what previously had been unimaginable. The reluctance also stemmed from the memory of the aftermath of World War I, when atrocity stories that had come out during the war proved in the aftermath of the war to have been unfounded. Many American leaders and members of the American public treated information about Nazi atrocities during World War II as similar exaggerations or falsehoods. This skepticism was shared by the press. Alexander Worth was a correspondent for the Sunday Times who visited Majdanek shortly after it was liberated. He saw firsthand the gas chambers, the mass graves, the mounds of human remains. And yet when he submitted his story to the BBC, they refused to broadcast it because, they wrote, they thought it was a Russian propaganda stunt. The New York Herald was equally reluctant to publish the story, claiming that even on top of all we have been taught of the maniacal Nazi ruthlessness, this example sounds inconceivable. It was only when Western allies began to discover concentration camps themselves that American attitudes changed. The big shift for Americans came in April of 1945 when American troops, including High Horowitz, liberated Ohrdruf, one of the subcamps at Buchenwald, located in central Germany, northeast of Frankfurt. The Ohrdruf camp was created in November of 1944, so a relatively late addition to the Nazi camp system. And it was created to use slave labor to build an elaborate underground bunker that the Nazis thought might be needed if the Allies took Berlin. While the bunker was never completed, by late March of 1945, there were 12,000 prisoners in Ohrdruf working 12 to 14 hours a day on starvation diets, doing heavy manual labor. But in early April, as the Allies closed in, the SS evacuated almost all the prisoners on death marches to Buchenwald. Thousands died or were shot as they were forced north and east. Those who were too ill to walk were murdered where they stood or where they lay. In all, somewhere around 7,000 people were murdered in the days before the Allied troops and High Horowitz arrived. High said that nobody should ever see what he saw when his tank arrived at Ohrdruf. Piles of bodies, some covered with lime, and others partially incinerated on pyres. With High's passing, we have to turn to other sources to tell us more about what he saw. This photograph gives some sense of what US soldiers confronted as they came into the camp. The corpses of prisoners killed in Ohrdruf shortly before the camp's liberation lying around. Another source is General Dwight David Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, who visited Ohrdruf with General Omar Bradley and George Patton on April 12th, just a week after High's division had liberated the camp. The visit had a powerful impact on Eisenhower and the other generals, who immediately pushed to make the world aware of what they had found. On April 19th, 1945, Eisenhower cabled General George Marshall, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington, D.C., with a request to bring members of Congress and journalists to the newly liberated camp so they could bring the horrible truth about Nazi atrocities to the American public. Eisenhower wrote, "We continue to uncover German concentration camps for political prisoners in which conditions of indescribable horror prevail. I visited one of these myself, and I assure you that whatever has been printed on them to date has been understatement. If you could see," this is to George Marshall, "if you could see any advantage in asking about a dozen leaders of Congress and a dozen prominent editors to make a short visit to the theater in a couple of C-54s, I will arrange to have them conducted to one of these places where the evidence of bestiality and cruelty is so overpowering as to leave no doubt in their minds about the normal practices of the Germans in these camps." The same day, Marshall received permission for a delegation from Congress to visit the liberated camps. Ohrdruf made a powerful impression on General Patton as well. He described it as one of the most appalling sights I have ever seen. He recounted in his diary, "When we began to approach with our troops, the Germans thought it expedient to remove the evidence of their crime. Therefore, they placed the bodies on a mammoth griddle composed of 60-centimeter railway tracks laid on a brick foundation. They poured pitch onto the bodies and then built a fire of pine wood and coal under them. They were not very successful in their operations because there was a pile of human bones, skulls, charred torsos on or under the griddle, which must have accounted for many hundreds." If you do a Google search for Ohrdruf and the liberation, you'll come up with a range of gruesome images from Eisenhower and Patton's visit. I chose not to include them here because I don't think that graphic evidence is really needed. But in the wake of Eisenhower's visit, he was moved by what he had seen to order all nearby units who were not on frontline duty to visit the camp at Ohrdruf or one at Nordhausen. According to Eisenhower, even if the GI did not know who he is fighting for, he would know at least what he was fighting against. Eisenhower also invited the world press to come and tour the camps, and newsreel footage from these visits finally reached American theaters on May 1st of 1945, shocking the nation to its core. Again, you can Google search some of those film clips, those newsreels. I'm not going to show them here. I said before that High Horowitz was somewhat representative of many Americans who went to fight during World War II. There was one thing, however, that notably separated High from the great majority of the 16 million Americans who fought during the war. High was one of 550,000 Jewish men and women who served in the army or in the war. Jews made up less than 4% of the American population in 1940, but almost half of Jewish men old enough to serve joined the fight. For High and other Jews fighting in the European theater, liberating the camps and seeing both Jewish victims and Jewish survivors was a particularly powerful experience. They knew that if they had been living in Europe, they would very likely be either dead or be those who they found as they liberated the camps on the edge of death. And this brings me to one other point. We refer to High and the other GIs who served as liberators. But in reality, they did much more than just free the prisoners. In a real way, they rescued the inmates of those camps. It was the arrival of the Allied troops that saved the prisoners from further brutality and starvation. And the GIs, like High, brought with them food and medical care. And perhaps as importantly, the GIs brought smiles and relief. If you read the accounts of Holocaust survivors who were liberated, you see countless references to American soldiers who gave their own rations, their food, or cigarettes or clothing to the prisoners that they found. So while I will follow the contemporary convention and call High a liberator, he was also without question a rescuer. I will add that in some ways, the rescued, the prisoners, also were able to give something to the GIs. Leonard Pinky Popach, an American in the 45th Infantry Division, captured that side of the equation in a letter he wrote to his family 2 days after liberating Dachau. It's a very powerful letter. He wrote, "I saw firsthand the things I have heard about and which I had never quite believed. Now I know that what this war is all about. Now I know why we're fighting. To me, all the suffering and misery I've had to put up with these past 8 months has been well worthwhile. Just to see the joy on the faces of these tortured, suffering people repaid all of us that saw 1,000-fold. I'm proud to be one of the many who finally helped free these poor souls who have been through a hell that the decent mind cannot imagine possible here on God's own earth." Let me conclude by going back to High Horowitz. High came back to the United States after the war. He got a job, raised a family, and moved out to East Meadow here on Long Island. But he remained an active member of the 7th Armored Division Association, the organization of veterans from his division, attending annual reunions and returning to towns in France and Belgium that he had helped liberate in 1944 when they had various celebrations to honor the actions of the American military. I heard his son describe how whenever his father was heading out, he'd grab his Lucky 7 hat and was ready to go. And you see a couple of images of him here wearing that hat. These images give a hint, I think, of the pride that High had for his service. But he wore the Lucky 7 hat in many trips to France, too. Indeed, he developed lifelong friendships with some of the residents in those French towns as he sought to sustain the connection created during World War II between France and America. And with that in mind, the French honored High Horowitz in 2009 with the National Order of the Legion of Honor, conveying upon him the title of Chevalier, of Knight. It's an honor that was created by Napoleon Bonaparte in 1802 to honor French soldiers who fought with particular bravery, or foreign individuals like High Horowitz, who performed acts of valor on French soil. The Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County is honored to include the photograph of High Horowitz in our museum gallery and to draw attention to all that he and the other liberators risked as they embraced their role as rescuer. I will stop there. If you have questions, and I know there are a couple, please type them in the Q&A window and I'll do what I can to respond. Let me also take a moment to put in an advertisement for some of our other upcoming programming. This coming Sunday, we'll hold the next program in our Sunday with Survivors series, in this case with Holocaust survivor Anita Weisbord, who will share information about her childhood in Vienna, her experiences on the Kindertransport, and her life after the war. I hope you'll join us for that. Then next Tuesday, as part of the David Taub Real Upstander film series, we'll be screening a PBS documentary entitled America and the Holocaust, Deceit and Indifference. The film describes some of the bureaucratic hurdles that were put up in the 1930s by the US State Department to reduce the number of German refugees who could come into the country. After the screening, we'll be joined by Christopher Boyan from the Office of the UN High Commissioner of Refugees, the UN Refugee Agency that was established in the wake of World War II. And he's going to help us connect that history with more contemporary refugee issues. And one more program to mention, next Wednesday, I will be back for my next Curator's Corner to talk about a photo of the opening of the Nuremberg trials that we show in our galleries. The Nuremberg trials opened 75 years ago next Saturday. So I'll be talking about the key figures in that photo and some of the larger perspective on the Nuremberg trials as we look back from today at that effort to provide justice after the Holocaust. You can find more details about these programs and all our upcoming programs on our website at www.hmtcli.org and click on the events tab. And I hope you'll also click on the Give Now button to make a donation to support our online programming. Okay, let me see about some of the questions that are out there. Do you know if people tend to struggle to believe that bigger tragedies are happening today when they're told that they are happening, or tend to believe that tragedies are not happening? This is a great question, and it's something actually I was talking about last night as part of our Kristallnacht, or part of a Kristallnacht program I was doing, which is there are refugee issues today across the world. Millions of people trying to find asylum and get out of dangerous places. People in India, in Kashmir, in China, in Afghanistan, in Sudan, in Myanmar. And I think Americans are, I'm not sure if they don't believe what's going on or that they don't really realize the scale of what's going on in some of these other countries, and so don't tend to act. We are, as we all know, we are covered with information now that comes in on the internet, on emails, on videos, on television, on newspapers, and sometimes it overwhelms us, I think. So that maybe is a way to think about what was going on during World War II as well, that people couldn't understand because there was so much information coming at them. So that's my thought about that. I think there's a couple of other questions. Okay, while it was natural for the GIs to give their rations, how quickly did they realize that it may have been causing more damage than good to camp inmates? Yeah, we know that the camp inmates, the prisoners who were rescued, because they had been surviving on so little food and on surviving barely on their starvation diets, that when they were given chocolate or higher calories food, their bodies actually rebelled against that. And I think information about the dangers of of GIs and if they gave that food to the camp inmates quickly got out within a couple of days, or even more quickly in the first day, as doctors came and told the GIs that there were risks, that they shouldn't be giving their food in any kind of way, and that they needed to find some smaller food to give. So I think it was pretty quick that the GIs learned about the risks of what they were doing. But the giving of clothing, the giving of a smile, I've heard this from several survivors who were liberated, who say that they just seeing a smiling face, a face of a person in a uniform who wasn't trying to kill them or beat them, that alone was an uplifting experience. Okay, thanks very much for tuning in. I look forward to seeing you at other programs soon, and I wish you all a good afternoon. Take care.